Welcome to Silicon Wafers. What is Ukraine's spymaster Kyrylo Budanov saying about deep strikes on Russian energy system and how those strikes are reshaping the battlefield and the very conduct of 21st century warfare? Unmanned capabilities are redefining the concept of attrition and vulnerability in modern warfare. And in this confrontation, Russia's size is not necessarily an advantage. Russia has suffered greater losses to its oil-supported war machine and economy from Ukraine's strikes than from Western sanctions. Kyrylo Budanov, head of Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, stated that we have inflicted much greater direct damage on Russia than any economic levers of influence that have been introduced so far. Western hesitancy, inconsistency of policy, ongoing dependencies on Russian resources, and refusal to close loopholes mean that the Russian treasury has earned billions of dollars in each year of the full-scale war, despite our awareness of the threat that Russia poses to Ukraine, to Europe, and to the international order that we helped create at the end of World War II. Budanov emphasized that Western sanctions have been placed on Russia and are currently insufficient to the task. The propagandist's line is that they have failed and only hurt the ones sanctioning far more than they hurt the aggressor, Russia. But that is demonstrably untrue. Why else would Russia expend such a fortune on propaganda infrastructure to counter the narrative that sanctions don't work unless they really work and cause the Kremlin real pain? But sanctions are not fully effective because we have not tried to fully enforce them, not tried to make them comprehensive, and not tied them to specific strategic goals. Ukraine has defined those goals: degrade Russia's capacity to wage war by cutting revenues from fuel, limit the fuel available to their army, and by inconveniencing the compliant population who refuse to challenge the genocidal aggression of their leaders. And let's face it, millions of Russians are actively involved in making this war machine function every single day and night of the week. Budanov emphasizes the need to continue and indeed intensify operations. If this continues as it is, it will not have an impact on the worldview of the Russian Federation, but maybe on the military complex it will have an effect. The interview these insights are taken from followed the most recent, highly significant Ukrainian attack on Russian capabilities targeting the Novokubishevsk refinery in the Samara region and the Orenburg gas processing plant. On top of that, Ukrainian forces hit a fuel and lubricants depot in temporarily occupied Berdyansk and an ammunition warehouse near the Kinburn Spit. On the night of October 18th, drones attacked the Vishkaima substation in the Ulyanovsk region, a key part of the area's energy system. There was also an explosion at the Avangard ammunition manufacturing plant in Bashkortostan. We have reported on that previously. And on October 17th, Ukrainian Defense Forces launched precision strikes on Russian military targets and facilities in occupied Crimea. The reason for the urgency in Budanov's tone and intent is because Russia is furiously trying to expand its military capability and capacity. For example, Russia is expanding one of its main air bases for strategic aircraft, Engels 2, and constructing new facilities for missile carriers. From this base, Russia conducts large-scale attacks on Ukrainian cities and civilians. Well, here is Budanov's thesis in his own words. Let's start with the headline. At the Kyiv International Economic Forum, Ukraine's military intelligence chief, Kyrylo Budanov, laid out the logic of hitting Russia's energy infrastructure. His line was blunt. In fact, he said, our strikes had more impact than the sanctions. It's just a mathematical truth. Budanov's remarks reported on October 16th, and this is from the new Voice of Ukraine. He added that sanctions pressure remains insufficient unless paired with direct action, i.e., Ukrainian drones and strikes against refineries and gas processing nodes. The impact is clear in the numbers. Verified industry data show that Russia's seaborne oil product exports plunged 17.1% in September versus August to 7.58 million tons as drone damage forced outages at key refineries. That's from Reuters. And Budanov's core claim is twofold. Firstly, economics as warfare. Cutting refining capacity pushes more crude oil into export channels while choking refined oil products supply. That includes diesel and gasoline. Cash flow falls, logistics wobble. The IEA backs the revenue squeeze. September refined exports slumped to their lowest since 2020, even as crude shipments rose to compensate. That's from Reuters. His second point is cumulative pressure. Each refinery outage multiplies the downstream pain. Local shortages, spikes in pump prices, temporary export bans, and attempts to impose price caps, retail price caps, by the Russian authorities. All this forces Russia to burn cash while trying to stabilize the domestic fuel market. See the recent calls in Moscow to rein in retail prices. That's from the Kyiv Independent. So, how does the deep strike machine work? There's an operational story here also. The Financial Times reported, and this is corroborated by Reuters as well, that US intelligence has been helping Ukraine plan the routes, timing, and altitudes of long range drones that can bypass Russian air defenses and hit critical energy sites. Here is the quote: US intelligence has helped Kiev with targeting data, including oil refineries far beyond the front line, and supports route planning, altitude, timing, and mission decisions. This is a Reuters write up of an FT report from October the 12th. US involvement, per those reports, intensified in midsummer as Kiev's domestic drone production scaled up. The FT source summaries describe up to 16 of Russia's 38 refineries struck since August, with diesel exports dropping to multi-year lows. That's from the Kyiv Independent. Well, why are they hitting refineries? Because that's Russia's lifeblood, feeding the front and Moscow's budget, civilian and, of course, military. The September export drop tracks with a wave of refinery hits. Ryazan, Yanis, Yaroslavl, Antipsky, Tuapse, and others. The net effect: shortages at home, fewer refined products to sell abroad, and a heavy reliance on risky maritime crude flows through choke point ports like Novorossiysk, and Ukraine is hitting those where it can too. But unfortunately, Russia has the power to punch back. In the last week, it launched one of the heaviest barrages of 2025 against Ukraine's energy system: 300 plus drones and 37 missiles in one single night, knocking out gas facilities like Shebelinka and triggering blackouts across multiple regions of Ukraine. That's reported in The Guardian. Well, let's turn to Budanov's statements on diplomacy, peace deals, and leverage. What about negotiations? Well, Budanov's message on October 16th was equally direct. A deal without Ukraine is impossible, he said. This is our war with them. Without Ukraine, it's unreal, simply unreal. That's re-reported via tch.ua. It's notable that Keith Kellogg was not present for the most recent screaming match in the White House, where Trump berated Zelensky, but Zelensky rightly did not concede an inch. Witless Witkoff understands nothing about history, context, or the concept of deterrence, but Keith Kellogg seems to have a strong grasp of the issues and what peace through strength means in practice. There are no such things as sanctuaries, Keith Kellogg said, referring to Russian oil industry targets. That is via a Medusa write-up of a Fox News interview from September 29th. Well, let's have a look at a single case study that is entirely illustrative of peace through strength as a concept. To understand the playbook, we must revisit Operation Spiderweb on June 1st. Ukraine's coordinated drone assault deep inside Russia against long-range aviation bases. Ukraine said that 41 aircraft, Tu-95s, Tu-22Ms, and A-50s were damaged or destroyed in the attack. That's according to AP News. Ukraine's Domestic Security Service, the SBU, publicly claimed the operation. Open source and Western estimates vary on the exact toll, the exact damage, but everyone agrees the hit was unprecedented in geographic spread and in the stress on Russia's bomber fleet and air defenses that it inflicted. It was a truly historic and impactful operation. Some of those details are from Reuters. Well, why bring this up today? Because the spiderweb template, deception, staging, masked autonomous systems is a template for the refinery campaign as well, containing a mixture of audacity, detailed planning, clear targeting tied to critical strategic outcomes, dispersed launch, long-range guidance, multiple axes, and overwhelming targeting of critical nodes of essential enemy infrastructure. It's also worth bringing this up to counter the argument that Ukraine has no cards. Rather than that question, which is inspired by false narratives, we should be asking how many more spiderweb operations are currently in the planning stages and how many of them are imminent this winter. Let's take a deeper look into the energy war this week. Russia is escalating, Ukraine is countering. As Ukraine has stepped up refinery attacks, strikes inside Russia, Moscow answered with one of its heaviest energy grid attacks since the invasion, over 300 drones and 37 missiles in a single wave, hammering gas systems and causing blackouts across at least 8 regions. That's according to The Guardian. Reuters adds that Ukraine has been forced to import more gas after repeated hits on production and processing facilities. The distinction of tactics, however, is still important. Ukraine strikes targets that are largely military or dual use and seeks to minimize casualties in these actions. I cannot recall any incident in almost 4 years of war where Ukraine has deliberately targeted Russian civilians. Russia, however, daily throws a significant part of its machinery of aggression against random civilian targets, apartments, hospitals, and even daycare centers, as we've seen in the latest attack today on Kharkiv. There is a complete asymmetry in the targeting of objectives to hit, but as the winter attrition grinds on and the struggle becomes more existential, we may see Ukraine broaden the energy-related sites that it deems to be dual use, encompassing not only refineries and export nodes, but also gas infrastructure and electricity generation facilities, as well as thermal power plants. So what does Budanov's crystal ball imply is coming next? What should we be expecting? These are 3 near-term potential trajectories. Well, one is more depth and more diversified targets. The FT Reuters reporting implies better route optimization and target prioritization. Think gas processing. For instance, the Orenburg support infrastructure to the Kazakh fields, port pumping stations and rail fuel depots. The Novorossiysk system is already under pressure from record crude flows and the impending cold weather and, of course, the drone risks. That's from Reuters. Secondly, refinery maintenance and opportunistic strikes. As plants enter seasonal overhauls, vulnerabilities start to spike. September's outages and October fires suggest the system is already brittle. Opportunistic hits can extend downtime and keep product exports suppressed. Ukraine may even aim for a certain cascade effect by hitting more nodes in the system. And thirdly, on the diplomatic front, expect harder diplomacy, not softer. Budanov's line that there is no deal without Ukraine is consistent with a peace through strength approach. Expect more statements and actions from Kyiv, stressing that deep strikes are about ending Russia's escalation dominance, about bringing peace closer. They're not about pure revenge and aggression. So, to wrap up, Budanov's message this week is that drones and direct action against energy infrastructure are working, measurably so, and must be paired with sanctions rather than a substitute for them or even a softening of them by international partners. He makes the important point that we are not doing nearly enough to change Moscow's mindset. At this point, we are an irritant to Putin, and our efforts are helping to contain Russia, at best, contain its aggression, maybe not even that. For a complete mindset change, we need to impose significantly higher costs on Russia and specifically on Putin. But we still insist on imposing our perception of what constitutes high costs onto the situation, and they just don't equate with what the Kremlin would consider to be painful and prohibitive costs. Our leaders and many of our strategists simply don't understand this, which was clearly displayed in a recent interview given by the ex-head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg. But we are also cautious because Europe's energy landscape remains fragile while Russia prosecutes an imperial war against Ukraine and a hybrid and informational war against Europe. Rather than not poking the bear, we should not be feeding the bear. Feeding the Russian bear only encourages it to attack us more vigorously and greedily. Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to make a personal recommendation that I know you will appreciate. You may have seen my interview last week with the producer of the film series Kyiv of Mine, Ronnie Apteker. Well, I've partnered with them to help raise awareness of what I believe is an important series of films made for a Western audience to help break through absurd stereotypes about Ukraine, some of which, of course, are amplified by Russian propaganda. You can watch these films for free now. Details in a second. Kyiv of Mine is a documentary series about Ukraine's extraordinary capital, which I had the privilege to visit for the first time in January this year. The film production began in 2018, and of course, much has changed since then. It's now 2025, and the story is far from over. Kyiv of Mine is a fast-paced, beautifully filmed, humorous, fun, insightful, heartbreaking, moving, and hopeful work. The very antithesis, in fact, of a doom-laden and worthy wartime documentary. This is a work that is extraordinarily uplifting. My friend Operator Starsky says the film is made with so much love. The film series will make you laugh and cry. It's the only film about Ukraine that began before the war yet has traced lives through the tumultuous times, and which follows the lives of more than a dozen Ukrainians in real time. This is an historic period told through highly personal and emotive stories from Kyiv's days of emerging prosperity after the Maidan Revolution through COVID and the full-scale invasion. This film is a breath of fresh air. Ukraine deserves a better conversation in the world, one that isn't centered around war, says Jolyon Ellis, filmmaker on Kyiv of Mine. It's hard not to argue with that, and the filmmakers have fully delivered on this promise. This is essential watching for anyone who calls themselves pro-Ukrainian, but I think it's also vital to get friends, colleagues, and family to watch it too, because the reality is few people have a vivid impression of Ukraine or any direct connection with its people. War is inhumane and abstract. Building an alternative perception is essential for engaging the world with the importance of Ukraine's struggle. A final word from our partners, the makers of Kyiv of Mine. All three films are now available to watch for free on YouTube. Please check out the links to the dedicated website, which tells you more about the film, its subjects, and the filmmakers. Also in the description is a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the films now. Do let us know in the comments what you think of them and if they inspire you as much as they have inspired me.